Aliens bragged about their long lifespan, until they met a human. The ambassador scoffed, his elongated violet-skinned fingers drumming against the crystalline table. "Humans," he said, voice thick with condescension, "you burn so bright yet so briefly. How tragic." The Galactic Summit chamber was filled with murmurs of agreement from the various alien delegations. The Valkai, an elder race whose members lived for nearly 10 millennia, smirked in their seats. The Serac, a species of sentient silicon, simply glowed in acknowledgement. Each of their kind had existed since before Earth had fire. Even the usually neutral Zalari let out a quiet, melodious chime of superiority. "Your kind," the ambassador continued, "are but flickering sparks in the eternal void. Here one moment, gone the next. What could you possibly offer the galaxy that we, with our millennia of experience, have not already perfected?" Captain Elias Carter sat at the lone human delegation table. He was older than most military representatives, with steel-gray hair and sharp blue eyes that had seen too much. A small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "I don't know," he said calmly. "How about endurance?" The Valkai ambassador's amusement deepened. "Endurance?" he repeated. "You misunderstand, human. We outlive you in ways your kind cannot comprehend. We have warriors older than your civilizations, architects who have designed planets before your species even left its homeworld. Endurance? You have none." Elias chuckled. He didn't need to raise his voice, yet the weight of his presence silenced the chamber. "Is that so?" Without breaking eye contact, he reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a simple, battered metal tag. A dog tag. It was old, older than anyone in the room had a right to be. The name etched onto it had long since faded, but the insignia was unmistakable. The silence deepened. The Valkai ambassador narrowed his eyes. "And what is that supposed to prove?" Elias placed the dog tag on the table and tapped it twice. "This belonged to my grandfather," he said. "He was part of the first human generation to step beyond our solar system. He carried this into battle against forces that outnumbered and outgunned him. He was wounded, outlived by every opponent he faced. And yet," Elias tapped the tag again, "he survived." The Zalari chime faltered. The Serac's glow dimmed. Even the Valkai ambassador's expression wavered for just a moment. Elias leaned forward. "Humans don't measure endurance in centuries. We measure it in defiance. In survival. In getting back up when everything in the universe tells us to stay down." The Valkai ambassador folded his arms. "A nice speech. But words don't change biology, Captain. When your species turns to dust, we will remain." Elias smiled. Not a smug smile. A knowing one. "You still don't get it, do you?" He stood, rolling up the sleeve of his uniform. Beneath it, the chamber could see his arm, scarred, lined with old wounds that should have long since crippled him. And yet there he stood, unbroken. "We don't need 1,000 years to change the galaxy," Elias said. "We only need one lifetime." The chamber doors burst open. A Zalari envoy rushed in looking frantic. "Urgent news from the outer colonies," she announced, voice vibrating. "A human soldier has been found. One of your kind, Captain Carter. But the records show he was supposed to be dead. Over 300 years ago." Elias froze. The room erupted into chaos. And in the back of his mind, something cold and familiar whispered, "That's impossible, isn't it?" Elias Carter felt something cold grip his chest. 300 years? No, that wasn't possible. The oldest human, even with cutting-edge medical advancements, barely reached 150. And a soldier? In active service? He clenched his jaw. This has to be a mistake. The Valkai ambassador, still leaning back with that smug expression, arched a brow. "How very interesting." Elias turned to the Zalari envoy, whose crystalline form vibrated with urgency. "Where is he?" The envoy hesitated. "Station Perseus 9, deep in the neutral zone. A derelict human ship was discovered drifting near a collapsed wormhole. The scans show a single life sign aboard." The chamber burst into murmurs. The Serac delegate's bioluminescence flickered rapidly, an expression of disbelief. Impossible. Even if a human somehow survived that long, the biological decay. Elias was already moving. "Get me a transport," he ordered. The Zalari envoy nodded and turned to her device, arranging passage. The Valkai ambassador chuckled. "Chasing ghosts, Captain Carter?" Elias met his gaze. "Wouldn't be the first time." The transport to Perseus 9 was tense. Elias sat alone in the cockpit of the Zalari vessel, watching the swirling void of space outside. 300 years. The idea gnawed at him. Even the longest-lived human war veterans, those enhanced with cybernetics, genetic treatments, or experimental longevity serums, hadn't lasted that long. His grandfather's dog tag felt heavy in his pocket. The moment the ship docked at Perseus 9, he stepped onto the dimly lit station. The air was stale, the metal walls rusted with age. Zalari researchers scuttled about, whispering in hushed tones. A lone Serac scientist approached him. "You're Carter," the silicon-based being said, its voice grinding like stone. "The human you seek is in the medbay." Elias nodded. "Take me to him." They walked in silence through dark corridors until they reached a containment room. Through the thick glass, Elias saw the figure on the medical table. His breath caught. The man was old, far older than any human should be. His skin was weathered, his hair pure white. And yet he was alive. Tubes connected him to machines pumping oxygen and nutrients into his body. His vitals were weak but stable. And then Elias saw the insignia on the man's tattered uniform. The Terran Defense Corps. An organization that hadn't existed in over 200 years. Elias turned sharply to the Serac scientist. "What's his name?" The Serac hesitated. According to the ship's logs, Lieutenant Adrian Kessler. The name sent a shockwave through Elias. Kessler. He knew that name. A war hero, long presumed dead after the Persephone, a colony defense frigate, was lost during a skirmish near an unstable wormhole. That had been centuries ago. And yet here he was. Elias took a step closer, pressing the intercom. "Lieutenant Kessler?" For a moment, nothing. Then the man's eyelids flickered. Slowly, painfully they opened. His gaze, though dulled by age, locked onto Elias. His lips trembled. And then, "How long?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of lifetimes. Elias exhaled. 300 years, Lieutenant." Kessler didn't react with shock. He closed his eyes briefly as if he already knew. When he spoke again it was hoarse. "We made it." Elias frowned. "What?" Kessler's fingers twitched, gripping the blanket over his chest. "The war," he rasped. "The last battle. Did we win?" Elias's stomach turned. "Which war?" Kessler opened his eyes again. And this time there was something there, something deep, something haunted. "The war you don't remember." Silence hung thick in the air. Elias swallowed hard. "What happened to you?" Kessler's eyes fluttered, struggling to stay open. "I was supposed to be dead," he murmured. "We all were." Elias clenched his fists. "What do you mean?" Kessler's breathing hitched. His vitals spiked briefly on the monitors. The Serac scientist stepped forward, ready to intervene, but Elias held up a hand. "Lieutenant. Focus." Kessler's gaze sharpened just a little. "We were left behind," he said, voice hoarse. "Not missing. Not lost. Erased." Elias felt the room tilt. "Erased by who?" Kessler's lips trembled. "The Council." The words hit like a physical blow. Elias staggered back. "That's impossible. The Galactic Council." "They covered it up," Kessler rasped. His breath came in ragged gasps now, as if speaking was costing him everything. The Persephone wasn't lost in a battle. He let out a dry, hollow laugh. "We weren't even supposed to exist anymore." Elias felt ice settle in his gut. 300 years. The Council had erased an entire war. He turned sharply to the Serac scientist. "I want every file on his ship. Every data log, every piece of recovered information." The Serac hesitated. "Captain Carter?" "Now." The scientist complied, stepping away to access the files. Elias turned back to Kessler, but the old soldier's eyes were already fluttering shut again. His energy was spent. But before unconsciousness took him, he forced out one final whisper. "They'll come for me." Elias stood there, heart pounding. If Kessler was right, the Council wasn't just hiding history. They were protecting a secret so big they had buried it for 3 centuries. And now the truth was waking up. The question was, how far would the Council go to keep it buried? The moment Kessler's rasping breath faded into unconsciousness, Elias felt a sharp prickle at the back of his neck. "They'll come for me." The words weren't a warning. They were a certainty. Elias turned to the Serac scientist, who was still processing the ship's data logs. His crystalline limbs twitched, an anxious tick among his kind. The dim glow of the terminals reflected off his smooth, obsidian-like skin. "How much have you recovered?" Elias asked. The Serac hesitated. The ship's data core was heavily damaged. Some files were manually deleted, others corrupted. But there's something else. Elias narrowed his eyes. What? The scientist exhaled, his inner bioluminescence pulsing. The moment we accessed these files, there was an external ping. Someone is listening. Elias's gut twisted. You're saying someone knows we found Kessler? The Serac nodded grimly. And if I'm reading this right, they already sent a response. Elias cursed under his breath. He activated his Carter to transport. What's our status? The response came immediately, but the voice wasn't his pilot's. Captain Carter. The voice was cold, clipped, and unmistakably synthetic. By order of the Galactic Council, you are to stand down and relinquish all data obtained from the derelict vessel. A kill team. Elias's mind raced. The Council wasn't taking chances. They weren't sending diplomats or legal representatives. They were sending eliminators. Your compliance is not optional. Elias turned to the Serac scientist. Shut down all access points to this system. Now. The scientist hesitated. If I do that, we lose access to the logs. Then get me what you can and wipe the rest, Elias snapped. They're not here to negotiate. They're here to make sure Kessler never talks. The Serac's eyes flickered in understanding. He moved swiftly, his crystalline fingers tapping over the control panels. Elias activated his sidearm. The Zalari researchers in the background began shifting nervously. They weren't soldiers. They had no idea what was coming. The station trembled. A distant thud reverberated through the metal walls. They had arrived. Elias pulled his rifle from his back, heart pounding. He turned to the medical bed. Kessler was still unconscious. I won't let them take him. The lights flickered. The comms crackled again. Final warning, Captain Carter. Elias tightened his grip on his rifle. Go to hell. The station doors blew open. The first wave was fast, too fast. Black armored council operatives stormed through the entrance, their movements unnervingly precise. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Elias fired first. His rifle's plasma burst slammed into the lead operative's chest, sending him sprawling back. Before the others could react, he rolled to the side, taking cover behind a control console. The Serac scientist barely ducked in time. The operatives didn't respond with shouts or demands. They simply opened fire. Blue energy bolts shredded through the med bay, burning into walls and machinery. Elias gritted his teeth. If these bastards were here, it meant one thing. The council really did erase an entire war. A second operative flanked left. Elias pivoted, firing two precise shots. One in the knee, one in the visor. The soldier dropped, his weapon clattering against the floor. More were coming. Kessler. Elias barked, ducking another barrage. The old soldier stirred, his eyes fluttering open. Elias shot the last operative in sight and rushed to the medbed. He gripped Kessler's shoulder. We need to go. Now. Kessler's face twisted in pain, but there was something else in his eyes now. Something Elias hadn't seen before. Recognition. They came back, Kessler murmured, his voice hoarse. Elias frowned. Who? Kessler's breath hitched. The ones who didn't want us to win. Elias didn't have time to question him further. The next wave was coming. He pulled Kessler up, draping one of the man's frail arms over his shoulder. The Serac scientist was already at the console, frantically inputting commands. I've got partial logs, enough to prove something was erased, the scientist said quickly. But if we don't leave now. Another explosion rocked the station. The emergency klaxons howled. Elias clenched his jaw. We're leaving. He tapped his Carter to Zalari transport. Get the engines hot. We're coming in fast. The reply came instantly. Copy. But we have incoming hostiles. 4 council frigates just exited hyperspace. Damn it. The council wasn't just sending a kill team. They were willing to erase an entire station to cover this up. Elias turned to Kessler, dragging him toward the corridor. The old soldier barely held his weight, but there was a fire in his eyes now. The fire of a man who remembered. The station was already starting to fail. Sparks rained from broken conduits. The artificial gravity flickered. The emergency bulkheads were sealing behind them, cutting off paths at random. The Zalari researchers fled in the opposite direction, no doubt trying to find escape pods. Elias kept his pace steady, Kessler's weight slowing him down. The Serac scientist ran ahead, his bioluminescence flashing urgently. Docking bay is this way. A council operative dropped from an overhead vent, landing right in front of them. Elias barely had time to react. The operative lunged, striking with inhuman speed. A fist slammed into Elias's ribs, felt like hitting a steel beam. He stumbled back, gasping. The operative drew a blade, sleek, monomolecular, deadly. Elias twisted at the last second. The blade skimmed past his throat, cutting a thin line into his collar. Too fast. Then, before Elias could counter, a gunshot. The operative jerked backward. A smoking hole burned through his helmet. Elias turned in shock. Kessler stood there, one of the fallen operative's sidearms trembling in his grip. Still got it, Kessler muttered, exhaling sharply. Elias grinned. Not bad for a dead man. The Serac scientist grabbed Elias's arm. No time to celebrate. Launch window is closing. Elias threw Kessler's arm over his shoulder again. Move. They sprinted down the final stretch of corridor, past smoking consoles and flickering lights. The docking bay doors loomed ahead. Then, another explosion. The far wall collapsed inward as a second squad of council soldiers breached the hangar. Elias swore. He was running out of ammo. Kessler's right. The council doesn't want to just bury this. They want to erase it. Elias steeled himself. Serac, get Kessler to the ship. I'll hold them off. The scientist hesitated. You won't last long alone. Elias exhaled, steadying his rifle. I don't need to. I just need to buy you enough time. Then, before the Serac could protest, Elias charged forward, opening fire. The council squad reacted instantly, returning fire. Plasma bolts ripped through the air, searing past his armor. Kessler has to make it. He's the proof. The last living proof. As he fired his last shot, something heavy slammed into his side. The world spun. Pain erupted across his ribs. He hit the floor, dazed. The last thing he saw was Kessler being dragged onto the ship, and the Serac hitting the launch sequence. Then, darkness. Pain. A deep, bone-aching pain spread through Elias's ribs as he stirred. His vision swam, flickering between darkness and dim emergency lighting. His head pounded like someone had taken a hammer to his skull. For a moment he wasn't sure if he was dead. Then he felt the cold metal of the docking bay floor beneath him, and the distant roar of engines firing. The ship. Kessler. Elias forced his body to move. His limbs were sluggish, but instinct took over. He rolled onto his side, coughing, every breath sending fire through his ribs. His ears were still ringing, but above the noise, he heard the council operatives closing in. His vision sharpened just in time to see one of them leveling a rifle at his head. No. Elias willed his body to move, but before he could even twitch, a shockwave tore through the bay. The Zalari transport ship ignited its thrusters at full burn. The force of the blast sent the nearest council operatives tumbling across the deck, weapons clattering. Elias barely managed to shield his face before the searing heat from the engines nearly cooked him alive. The ship's landing gear detached, and for one heart-stopping moment, Elias thought it would leave without him. But then, a rope. No, a tether. It whipped through the air, snapping into place just inches from his outstretched hand. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed hold, his burned fingers barely closing around the cable before the transport lurched upward. A brutal yank wrenched him off the ground, his wounded ribs screaming in protest. He swung wildly, barely keeping his grip as the ship's rapid ascent dragged him out of the docking bay. The council operatives scrambled, trying to fire, but the ship's ventral guns rotated in a heartbeat and unleashed hell. Explosions ripped through the hangar below. The last thing Elias saw before being hauled into the ship was the station breaking apart. Cracks forming along its hull, the integrity failing. The council had sent an execution squad. Instead, they were the ones being buried. The bay doors vanished beneath him. Then only open space. Strong hands yanked Elias into the airlock. He collapsed onto the metal floor, gasping, his vision swimming. The pressure door slammed shut behind him, muffling the deafening roar of battle outside. "You look like hell," a familiar voice muttered. Elias cracked one eye open. Kessler. The old soldier was slumped against the bulkhead, still pale but alive. Elias let out a breathless laugh. "Takes one to know one." Kessler smirked. It was a tired, worn-out expression, but there was fire in his eyes now, not the empty, hollow look from before. Elias forced himself upright. His entire body screamed in protest, but he ignored it. He turned toward the cockpit. "What's our status?" The Serac scientist looked up from the controls, his crystalline skin dimmed from exhaustion. "Not great," he admitted. 4 council frigates still in pursuit. We don't have the speed to outrun them." Elias clenched his jaw. "Weapons." The Serac hesitated. "Minimal. If they hit us with even a single ion barrage, we're finished." Elias exhaled sharply. Options. Kessler stirred. We don't need to fight them. Elias turned. You got a plan? Kessler nodded toward the ship's terminal. The logs? We send them out. Elias frowned. The Council controls the networks. They'll scrub anything we try to transmit. Kessler's smirk widened. That's why we don't send it directly. Elias's eyes narrowed. What are you thinking? Kessler inhaled slowly. During the war, before they erased us, we had an emergency failsafe. A way to force the truth out no matter what. Elias leaned in. Explain. Kessler's hands shook as he tapped into the console. Despite the tremors in his fingers, he moved like a soldier who had done this before. Back in the old days we had something called a cascade burst. A virus, in a way, but instead of deleting data, it forces duplication. It spreads. Every time someone tries to delete it, it sends a new copy somewhere else. Elias's heart pounded. You're saying we can't just send the logs? We can make them impossible to erase? Kessler nodded. Every node, every relay, every backup drive in the known galaxy. Once it starts, it won't stop. Elias turned to the Serac scientist. Can you do it? The Serac hesitated, then nodded. If you have the right sequence, I can implement it. Kessler's hands trembled as he typed the command. For a moment, Elias saw flashes of memory in his expression. Battlefields lost to time, comrades long dead, a war that history said never happened. Then, he hit enter. The terminal flashed red. A progress bar appeared. Transmitting? The Council's response was instant. Their frigates opened fire, plasma bolts raking across the Zalari ship's hull. The shields flickered, holding but not for long. Elias strapped into the co-pilot's seat. We need to hold out until the burst completes. The Serac nodded, pushing the engines to their limit. I'll try to keep us from getting vaporized. Kessler exhaled. They're panicking. Elias glanced at him. How do you know? Kessler smirked. Because the only reason they'd still be shooting is if they haven't stopped it yet. Another explosion rocked the ship. The hull groaned. A warning siren blared. Then, the transmission bar reached 100%. The terminal flashed green. Cascade burst initiated. A split second later, the nearest Council frigate halted mid-fire. Then another. Then all of them. The Serac scientist's eyes widened. They've stopped. Elias frowned. What's happening? The Serac's crystalline fingers danced over the controls. A transmission log scrolled across the screen. It's spreading. His voice was breathless. Every Council ship, every relay, they're all being flooded with the erased war records. Elias's stomach clenched. Then we just started something bigger than we even realize. Kessler chuckled weakly. Good. By the time they broke into hyperspace, the galaxy was already changing. The cascade burst couldn't be stopped. It replicated, copied, and forced the truth into the open. Across the galaxy, planets once told that humans had only been in space for a few centuries were seeing images of battlefields they were never supposed to know existed. Politicians scrambled. Council officials denied everything. But it didn't matter. The truth was out. Kessler sat in the ship's medbay, staring at nothing. Elias stepped inside, arms crossed. You good? Kessler exhaled. I don't know. He looked down at his hands. I spent centuries knowing that I was the last one left. That everything we fought for was gone. He looked up at Elias. And now, the whole damn galaxy knows. Elias smirked. So what happens next? Kessler's lips curled into a grin. We remind them why they were afraid of us in the first place. The end. Rocket fire. Fire. If you love this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an epic HFY tale. Speech balloon. What would you do if you were the last human from a forgotten war? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Rocket. For more HFY greatness, check out our latest stories in the playlist.